Ever stood under a sky so wide your secrets felt small? Here on Cowboy Time, story we ride the stories of the West campfire truths, trail dust, memories, saloon whispers. Gritty human, sometimes messy. Every tale is a horizon to chase. Subscribe, pull up a stool, and maybe find a little courage for your own frontier. The wagon wheels screamed against the axle, a thin metal cry that rode the wind. The San Luis Valley opened in every direction, pale grass scabbed over with salt. The Sangre de Cristo peaks bruised violet along the rim of the sky. Nora Hale kept the mules steady with cracked hands and a split lip. Her palms felt like glass. Each tug on the reins burned. Lydia curled under a thin army blanket, dust in her eyelashes, breath fogging against the wool. She watched the horizon as if a town might rise out of it. It did not. At Nora's feet, a canvas bundle trembled with the wet rattle of Maggie Finch's cough. The sound had its own rhythm. It counted time better than any clock. They left the stage road 3 days before following a pencil map lifted from the back of a freight bill. The lines were crooked. The country was worse. When the homestead showed at last, they almost missed it. Dry cedar sat in a fold of land gray boards, leaned south, shingles scaly with sun. One fence lay flat like a broken rib cage. The windmill had only one blade left, and it knocked against the tail vane with a dull, patient clack. Lydia let out a noise that was not a word. "It is standing," Nora said. That was all. She set the brake and climbed down. Her knees gave. Dirt rose in a pale puff around her boots. She crossed the yard without looking at the door, because the door hung crooked, and she did not want to know what waited past it. The wellhead stood white and bleached. The rope was gone. The bucket was there, rusted through at the seam. Nora leaned over the stone lip and listened. A soft echo came back, then the small slap of water, a quarter full by the shine of it, alkali skimming the top like frost. She saw herself in the dark circle. The reflection wavered when the wind stirred. Behind her, Maggie coughed until her breath snagged. "Get her onto the boards," Nora said. "Not the dirt." Lydia slid from the wagon boots, sinking in powder. Together they pulled the tarp back and lifted Maggie. She weighed nothing. The bones of her hips pressed through the blanket. "Cold," Maggie whispered, working her fingers against the hem like she could pick the chill apart. "We will light the stove," Nora said. In there, Lydia looked past Nora into the house. In there. The room smelled of mouse droppings and old damp rot. A chair lay on its side, one leg splintered. Dust rode the floorboards in a thick pelt. Nora set Maggie on the table and put a folded coat under her head. Lydia found a candle stub in a drawer and a box of sodden matches. The first two split. The third took. The flame made their shadows long and wrong across the walls. Nora opened the iron firebox. Cold ash lay against the grate. She tipped her chin and peered up the flue. It was black and packed with straw bits of twig, a dead bird crumpled into its own feathers. She closed it again. "Not yet," she said. "Air it first." She cracked the door and set the candle on the hearth where the light could learn the room. She went outside. The yard was a scatter of gray and silver, everything the same old tired color, except near the chopping block. There the chips were white, as fat sticky with sap. The smell of resin cut clean through the alkali. Not 5 years, not 5 months. Someone had worked here after the last snow. Her neck prickled. Nora stepped away and her boot brushed a wire. She froze. The line ran ankle-high between two sage clumps the color of dust and old twine. A snare. She crouched and traced the twist. The hinge was made from a scrap of telegraph line. The knot was neat. She tipped it with her finger and dropped it back. Lydia stood in the doorway, arms crossed under the blanket. "I am checking the foundation." Nora moved past the woodpile and the snare and followed the dry cut behind the barn. A thin vein of water showed there no more than a trickle, still enough to stitch a strip of mud along the bank. A set of reeds shook where there was no wind. She looked down. A boot print pressed deep. The heel was worn to a hard crescent. The tread chewed the toe, turned slightly in. A man. A large one. She dragged the side of her boot across the print until the mud turned to a smear. When she came back to the porch, Lydia was staring at her face like it held a verdict. "Is it ours?" Lydia asked. "Is it empty and ours?" Nora reached inside her bodice for the paper she had folded and refolded until the creases felt like rope. The deed said, "Dry Cedar Homestead, sold $20 to the name she had practiced until the letters looked like a man's." The ink had bled where the lamp smoked. She did not show Lydia the signature. She let the seal flash once and put it away. "We bought it cheap in Pueblo," she said. The words felt like a plank she put between them and the drop. Lydia watched her mouth and not her eyes and nodded. "Water?" Nora asked. The well stinks. The creek tastes like nails. We boil it. Nora took the old bucket anyway. Reddish flakes fell from the seam when she lifted it. It would hold long enough. Maggie thrashed on the table. Her lips were gray at the corners, a stain of red on her handkerchief, like a flower too bright for the season. Lydia wet the cloth and laid it on Maggie's forehead. Nora, hear it. I hear it. Nora set her bedroll by the stove and took the broom from the corner. The bristles were chewed down to nubs, the stick smooth with old use. She stood and looked up at the black mouth of the flue again. Somewhere in there, a nest waited to tumble. Somewhere in there, smoke had tried to go and had been denied. She let the broom rest against the hearth and turned to the door. The light was going as if someone was wringing it out. The sky went from pale to pewter. A line of geese arrowed low, and their bellies caught the last good gold. The wind sheared down from the pass and hissed through the grass against the siding. Lydia pulled the blanket higher. Someone sleeps here, she said. Or did. What you saw were shavings, Nora said. Old ones. They were white, Lydia said. They were soft. Nora let the words slide and went to the well. She leaned until her breath sent small rings over the dark circle. The reflection broke and came back. Broke and came back. When she dipped the buckets, the scrape on stone sounded too loud, like she was calling. The water rose with a grit that smelled of tin. She took a drink anyway. It lined her tongue with powder. They moved Maggie to the corner near the stove where the boards were less drafty. Lydia found a cracked plate and a bent fork and lined them up beside the candle, a table set in a room where no one had eaten in years. Nora tied the door shut with a length of rag. The latch was split. She pulled 2 nails from a fallen shelf and beat them back in with the broom handle until the heads shone with fresh metal. Lie down, she told Lydia. I will sit, Lydia said. If I lie down, I will not wake up. Nora did not argue. She took the first watch without saying so. She sat on the step with her back to the jamb and listened to the house talk to itself. Nails ticked as the wood cooled. A mouse skittered in the walls. The candle sighed when a draft found it, and the flame leaned and stood again. Across the yard, the barn roof had a hole big enough to lay a moon through. A dark shape slipped behind it and did not return. Nora's hand went to the rifle in the wagon without looking. She felt the weight of it in memory and let the feeling be enough for now. Up on the shoulder of the slope, the piñon threw a long stain over the rocks. A man lay there on his belly with a spencer across his arms. He saw the white chips by the block and the string low to the sage. He saw the woman at the well lift the bucket like it weighed a town. He touched his shoulder where the bone never had set right and eased the ache with his palm. When the first cold took the bottom of the hill, he did not go. He watched the thread of smoke that was not yet smoke slide from the crooked stovepipe and fold into the wind. His name was Jonah Mercer. The valley called to no one. It kept what it could. He let the rifle settle into the dust. He did not raise it. Night closed fast like a door pulled tight. The candle spilled a shallow pool of gold on the boards and left the corners to the mice. Nora stood beneath the iron mouth of the flue and felt the room breathe wrong. The first kindling caught, and then the smoke pushed back down into their faces. It tasted of soot and nest and the sweet rot of old straw. "Cover your mouth," she said. Lydia pressed a damp cloth to her lips and eyes. Maggie coughed until the veins stood in her temples. The sound ripped through the room and set the window glass to a dull tremble. Nora planted a stool under the stovepipe and climbed. The broom handle felt slick with age. She jammed it up into the throat of the chimney. The bristles snagged on sticks and twine. She pushed harder. A bird husk fell first. It hit her shoulder and flopped to the hearth in a silent sprawl of feathers. Then came a rush of straw and ash that turned the air black. It settled in her hair and on her tongue. She kept her eyes open anyway. "Open the door," she said through the cloth. Lydia tugged the rag knot loose and cracked the door. Cold rushed in a clean knife that cut the smoke and brought its own ache with it. The fire licked and then faltered and then steadied. The stovepipe shook once, as if it had decided something. A thin line of gray lifted and slid toward the sky. Outside, the valley tuned its voice. A long howl rose from the east ridge, answered by another, closer, and then another. The mules slammed the stall boards and stamped until the old wood groaned. The hole in the barn roof took the sound and made it bigger. Lydia's eyes found Nora's. They did not speak. Nora eased the door shut and pushed the nails in deep with the broom handle again. She hooked the broken latch with a loop of rag and a bent spoon. She fed the iron belly of the stove with split slats and a twist of resin sticky from the block. The flame took and grew bright as a small victory. Warmth leaked out in careful threads. It made a circle on the floor. Nora dragged the table with Maggie on it until the circle reached the legs. Maggie's breath slowed from a rattle to a wet saw. She stared at the ceiling and watched nothing. "Drink," Dora said. She held the tin cup to Maggie's mouth. The water smelled of metal and stone. A little ran down Maggie's chin and left a dark line on her throat. Lydia sat with her back to the door and her knees up. Ash had turned her lashes gray. "Heard them," she said, "meaning the wolves." "I heard them," Nora said. "Think they will try the barn." "They will try the world," Nora said. "We will keep the fire." The house settled into a rough order. The candle wore down and was pinched and relit. The stove ticked as it found its heat. Every now and then the flue coughed a small black gust, and then returned to that thin white thread that showed above the roofline. Nora sat on the stool and scraped soot from her wrists with her fingernails. The soot went into the lines of her hands and stayed there. Clouds moved low and fast. The smell of snow came and then left. Across the yard the barn shadow lifted, and a man stepped out of it and then back in again. He was bareheaded, hair tangled to his shoulders. He touched the door with his fingertips and felt the splintered grain. Inside, the mule swayed and blew. He rubbed the nearest neck where the fur had worn smooth under a collar not made here. The stamp on the hame iron was a shape he knew. He drew his hand back and looked at it as if it had told a story he did not like. He climbed the ladder to the loft and seated himself in the dark legs over the edge boots hooked on a rung. Through the hole he could see a slice of sky and one sharp star. The hay had kept its summer smell in the middle, even with the roof torn. He watched the house. He watched that new smoke learn to stand. The first coil was the wrong color. The next one was right. He breathed when it turned. He thought about the quick ways to end a problem. One rifle round into the lantern on the table would find the floorboards and the draft. One shout in the yard would turn the wolves from the ferrying elk paths to this softer thing. The thoughts came and left with no heat in them. His body ached with a familiar ache that started where the bone had split and spread through the ribs. He shifted against the post and did not bother to hide the sound from himself. Inside, Lydia scraped a place on the boards with the heel of her boot and set the candle there. She stared at its flame like it was a person. "I can sit the first half," she said. "You can sleep." Nora shook her head. "If I sleep, I will dream. If I dream, I will drop the fire." Lydia nodded, as if that made sense. She tucked the blanket around Maggie's feet and listened to the wind. "This house breathes," she said. "It leaks," Nora said, but not unkind. "Tune." She took the broom and swept ash back from the mouth of the stove. She laid 2 sticks across the coals and watched their ends blacken. Her eyes kept drifting to the seam of the door. The wolves settled into a pattern, a call here, an answer there. It made the hair lift on the inside of Nora's forearms. When the sound came closest, one mule screamed and then fell silent. Nora stood and then sat again. She counted to 20 and to 40 and to 60 and stopped counting because numbers were a thin rope and she could feel it fray. Maggie's cough came and went in smaller fits. Between them, she drifted in a shallow sleep. Her hand found Lydia's sleeve and held it like a knot. Lydia did not move. Nora went to the well once more and brought a dipper of cold that shone with a faint sheen. She opened the door wide enough for her hip and no more, then closed it and set the dipper on the table. The draft made the candle lean and then stand again. She watched the flame straighten and felt her jaw do the same. Up in the loft, Jonah reached into the saddlebag he had kept above the rafters and took out a small tin of coffee. He turned it in his hands and put it back without opening it. He lay on his side and folded his coat under his head. Through the hole, frost gathered at the edge of a broken shingle. The breath from the mules rose in slow clouds and drifted into the missing roof like offerings. Sometime after the wolves went quiet and the wind settled into a low run, the stove found it steady. The iron glowed a dull orange at the seam. A line of smoke climbed straight and narrow white against the dark. Nora slept for a finger of time with her chin to her chest and woke hard, hand on the poker before her eyes were open. Lydia's head nodded and jerked and then stilled. Maggie breathed like a saw in wet wood, and then like a child caught between cries. Dawn took the valley in small bites. The far ridge lightened. The grass went from black to pewter to the color of old coins. The frost on the window made fern patterns and then melted back into water. The room smelled of iron and ash and a little heat. Nora stood and stretched her hands toward the stove and felt the blood return to her fingers like a slow crawl. She checked the draw and heard it pull. The first bird called from the willows by the cut. In the loft, Jonah sat up and listened, and rubbed his shoulder once and then again. He slid down the ladder without sound and crossed the barn with his palm on the mule that had not screamed. He put his ear to the door and heard the small life happening inside the house. The valley did not change for them. It was the same pale and the same cold. The smoke rose straight. The wolves were somewhere else. The iron held its heat. Nora opened the door a hand's width and let in a blade of morning. She looked once over the yard at the white chips by the block, at the trail the bucket had left in the dust, at the line of her own boots across the porch. Then she closed the door and set the bar again and turned back to the work of keeping what little they had. Morning put a thin shine on the frost and left the creek in shadow. The stove held a faint heat. Smoke rose clean and straight from the pipe, white against a washed sky. Nora broke a biscuit of cornbread on the table, the crumbs bright as dust motes in the slant of light. She made 3 pieces. The largest went to the tin plate she set near Maggie. The next, she laid on the sill by the candle stub. The smallest she pressed into her apron pocket without comment. Maggie blinked at the ceiling. Her breath snagged and sawed. When the cough caught her, she folded like a knife red showing on the cloth that Lydia lifted to her lips. The stain bloomed through the linen and cooled purple at the edges. "Let me wash," Lydia said. "Please. The dust is in my hair. I taste it when I breathe." Nora tied a scarf at her own neck and watched the window for a long beat. The valley had the quiet of a room where someone sleeps. Take the small soap. Stay by the crib willows. Do not go past the bend. "I will not," Lydia said. She took the sliver of lye and the towel and stepped out into the yard. The air had a bite that found the inside of her nose. Her boots whispered in the grass. When she reached the willows, the wind softened, and the creek showed itself narrow and clear, cold as cut glass. She looked over her shoulder. The house was a tilt of gray boards and a thread of smoke, no movement at the door. Lydia unbuttoned with stiff fingers, breath fogging the air in front of her mouth. The calico fell and the chemise followed. Her skin raised in a rush of bumps when the air touched it. She stepped into the water and hissed, teeth clenched. The cold climbed her shins and then her thighs, an ache that argued with the thought of being clean. She cupped water and let it slide over her hair. It ran down her arms in quick silver streams and fell back to the current. On the far bank, a shape moved among the pinyon shadows, silent as a cat. Jonah traced his snare line with a practiced hand palm, feeling for a pull that was not there. He heard the first splash before he saw her. He took one step back and put the trunk of a tree between himself and the sound. His hand went to the rifle without thinking and then stopped there, fingers on cold steel. Through the gray dart of willow leaves he saw white, the arc of a shoulder, the ladder of a spine. The water caught her ribs and flattened against them and slid away. His heart made one hard move and then hung. He closed his eyes and brought the heel of his hand to his brow and pressed until stars jumped behind the lids. He told himself to turn to walk upstream to count his snares and check the high set where the rabbits threaded the sage. He did not move. Lydia ducked to wet her hair and gasped when the cold took the back of her neck. She came up with her lashes stuck together and a sound in her throat that could have been a laugh or a sob. She rubbed the lye between her palms until it bit at the skin and then smoothed it through her hair with slow strokes. The smell was harsh and clean. The creek took the suds and pulled them thin. Back at the house, Nora folded the blooded cloth into itself and set it out of sight under the edge of the table. She poured a thumb of water in a cup and swished it until the metal shone. She did not drink. She put the cup back, wiped the rim with the heel of her hand, and cut the cornbread again with a dull knife, as if more might be made from what was there. Maggie coughed once and went still. For a breath, the room felt like a stopped heart. Then her chest lifted small and stubborn, and the sound returned high and wet, more hum than hack. Nora rested her palm on Maggie's shin and felt bone under wool. She was not thinking of prayers. She was counting wood, counting matches, counting how long the stove held after the last stick. She was counting the work that kept a body from breaking. At the creek, Lydia lifted her face to the same washed sky and let the light touch her closed eyes. She rinsed the soap and felt her scalp sting. When she reached to wring her hair, the water ran down her chest and left cold lines that she chased away with her palms. Her breath steadied. The ache turned into a kind of clarity, the way cold can make a bell out of bone. Jonah forced his gaze off her and down to the bank. Mud showed a new pattern where a small bird had hopped and left a dotted trail. He fixed his sight on that and walked it with his mind. It did not hold. He looked again, not wanting to, because the mind does not answer to orders like the hand does. He saw the thin shoulder blade and the notch above the hip. He saw the pale meat of a person without the armor of rags. He felt shame rise like heat and sit on his face. He thought of a window with flames inside it and a voice that carried his name through smoke until the roof fell. He put his forehead to the rough bark and breathed once like a man about to dive. Lydia stepped out of the creek. Her toes went numb on the stones as she found her towel. Her reflection broke in the ripples and came back as a new shape each time. For a flicker, she thought she saw another face behind hers in the water, lighter and longer. Then a breeze folded the surface and the creek returned to its simple cold. She dried fast fingers clumsy. She pulled the chemise on and then the dress cloth clinging to damp skin. She plaited her hair with quick motions and tied the end with a scrap she kept in her pocket. The cut of air on her wet neck made her wince. She stepped away from the bank and into the open where the sun reached. For 1 second she felt viewed the way a rabbit freezes when the hawk shadow runs across the ground. She turned. Nothing moved but the loose end of line that sang on a broken telegraph pole, a faint high note in the wind. Jonah let go of the tree and took a step deeper into the pinyon shade. He kept himself between her and the rifle barrel by habit, as if the gun could act on its own if given a clean path. He looked past the willows toward the house. The thin smoke still rose. In the open door he saw a figure move and thought of a woman who would not sleep for fear of losing what she watched. Nora set the small piece of cornbread back on the sill. She took the largest to Maggie and tore it into a mash with her fingers. She pressed it to Maggie's lips. When the woman swallowed it, it made a sound like an old hinge. Nora put the middle piece on a plate where Lydia would see it and not feel like a child. She touched the pocket where the smallest rested and felt its weight light and stubborn. Maggie coughed again, and this time the red came bright, a wet paint across the linen. Nora did not start. She put the cloth in a bowl and poured water over it and watched the color cloud and then pale. Her jaw worked once. She set the bowl aside and reached for the kettle to find something like heat that was not a flame in a wall. Lydia came back to the yard with the towel around her neck and color in her face that the cold had slapped there. Her eyes were clear. She lifted a hand in a small wave that was also a question. Nora answered with a look and a tilt of the head that meant the door, the stove, the work. Lydia nodded and went inside, quickly shutting the cold out with her shoulder. Across the creek, Jonah crouched and checked the set of his closest snare. He rubbed sap from his thumb into the loop to quiet it. He cut a fresh twig with his knife and smelled the resin as it opened. The scent was clean and sharp, the kind that stays in a man's beard through a day without food. He slid the knife home and stood. He watched the door swallow the girl and the house hold her. He thought about the 2 pieces of bread he had seen, and the third he had not. He turned up the draw boots, finding the quiet ground without thought. The water whispered at his side. The pinyon shadow kept his shape long and thin on the stones. The valley sounded like a place holding its breath. The smoke lifted straight and fine. The creek moved under it, cold and sure. By late morning, the frost pulled back into the shade and left the flats damp and the grass slick. The stove kept a small hold on its own heat. The room smelled of ash wool and the iron tang of boiled creek water. Nora took the Winchester from the wagon and checked the sight against the line where the ridge met the sky. The weight of the rifle dragged at her shoulder. She looped the strap and told Lydia, "Keep the door barred if I am not in your eye." Lydia nodded and set her palm on Maggie's ankle. Maggie slept with her mouth a little open breath, dragging like cloth torn in a straight line. The candle leaned and stood again. Nora cut behind the barn and followed the dry cut toward the low brush. The creek there ran thin and fast, just enough to lay a stripe of shine through the willows. The ground gave under her heel and took it back with a wet sound. Sage reached for her skirt. A grasshopper stuck to the hem and stayed there. She moved slow because the rifle asked for it. She watched the ground more than the horizon. Tracks told stories if a person listened. Rabbit along the bank, small and zigging. Coyote across steady and cocked a little left. A buck had been here before the freeze. The mud had held the imprint and then set it into memory. Sun hit the barrel and flashed. She shifted the rifle and went into the thin stand of aspen, where the trunks wore scars the color of old ivory. The air there had a silver tint to it. A jay scolded from high and moved tree to tree without showing itself. Her boot caught on something that looked like ground. The twigs gave with a hiss. The lattice sagged. Her body made the decision before her mind did. She twisted hard and threw her weight backward. The world snapped into sound. To her right, there was a crack like a stone thrown hard at dead wood. She dropped on her hip and slid on damp leaves and old pine needles and felt the rifle dig a bruise into her spine. Her boot scraped the edge of a hole and kicked a curtain of dust into the air. She rolled and looked. The pit lay open. 10 feet down, maybe more, a bed of sharpened stakes pointed up gray and mean, each one cut clean and set in packed earth. Old leaves had fallen between them and turned into a sod that made the points look like teeth through gum. The shoulders of the pit were crisp where the cover had just broken. A few masked twigs still lay across one corner, charmed into place by habit. She reached out and pressed her palm on the cut edge. Fresh. The dirt held her print and then let it go. She turned her head to the right where the crack had come from. A dead pine there had taken a hit. Large flakes of bark had come down and lay in a fan around a flat rock that did not belong. The rock still rolled a little in its dust. Someone had thrown it. Nora listened. The aspen leaves clicked like small coins. Far off, a hawk gave a short cry and was done. Closer, her own breathing ran loud. She pushed herself to sitting and found she had dirt under her tongue. She spat and wiped her mouth with the back of her wrist and looked up the slope. The pinon cast their neat dark patches over the rock. There in the seam between two stones, a darker shade moved and then became nothing. She told herself it was a deer. A buck can stand and hold and let his shadow do the work. She told herself that she had misstepped, and luck had corrected it. She stood and felt the bruise in her side tell her the story in a simpler way. She stepped around the pit with a wide arc and kept her eyes on the ground until she had reached the dry cut and could see the barn roof tilt through the trees. On the slope above, Jonah eased back from the edge until the pinon gave him cover. He kept the rifle in his left hand to spare the ache in the right shoulder and felt the old pain remind him of Copper Gulch of hooves on shale and men shouting through smoke that looked like rain. He had watched her put her foot on the woven cover like a child testing ice. He had picked the rock and thrown at the dead tree without thinking. The sound had done its job. She had twisted away from death into a smaller hurt. He sat with his spine against the stone and let the anger come. It came quiet. He was angry at the hole for needing to be there, at the hunger that had made it worth digging 2 summers back at the world that made a snare a kind of insurance. He had intended that pit for a deer that had learned the smell of iron and would not take a wire. He had not built it for a woman with black hair and a mouth set hard as a gate. His hands found a stick and broke it twice, and then again into useless lengths. Nora reached the barn and stood in its shadow until her breathing evened. She laid the rifle across her forearms and let her fingers rest on the sight, as if it were a piece of warm rail. She looked back toward the stand of aspen. The bright patch where the lattice had given way looked like an open eye. She felt watched and scolded herself for it. She went to the pump by habit and then remembered there was none. The well bucket waited with its rust line and its promise. Inside the house, Lydia had pulled the ladder to the attic hatch and climbed. The smell met her first. Dried mint and mouse droppings and iron-cold dust. The roof boards ticked in the weak sun. Her head came level with trunks stacked too high along the wall. A broken cradle with one rocker missing a spinning wheel with a spoke cracked through. She put her knee on a tread and something small fled under the boards. She told herself not to think of nests and let her hand feel for steadier footing. She opened a trunk. Inside lay folded shirts gone stiff with old starch, a quilt with a pattern of saw teeth, and a stain the size of a hand, a length of blue ribbon crushed flat. Under that, a tin box no bigger than a book, its hinge orange with rust. She worked the lid until it clicked and lifted. A daguerreotype lay inside silvered plate in a bent paper frame. 2 figures stood in front of a house that had not had time to gray. The man wore a dark suit that did not fit. His jaw set like he was keeping a word from falling out. The woman at his side smiled with her mouth and held a hand at her waist as if a child either had been there or would be soon. The windmill in the background had all its blades, and the sky behind it was clean. Lydia felt the floor under her knees as if it were a boat. She ran her thumb over the edge of the plate and then held it to the hatch where the light was better. The man's eyes were light, a pale that the process had not muddied. She looked at his mouth again and felt a small certainty about a thing she could not say. She climbed down with the tin under her arm. Nora had set the rifle on the table and was unknotting a strip of rag. Her hair held a little burr that she had not noticed. Lydia laid the picture flat and pushed it toward her. Look. Nora wiped her fingers on her skirt and picked up the plate. The weight of it surprised her. She cleaned a thumbprint from the corner and saw the house the way it had been. The boards bright, the porch square, the fence not yet defeated by wind. The man stood there like a post. The woman's face had blurred where the silver had tarnished and made a halo. "Who is he?" Lydia asked. "Dead," Nora said. "You do not know that. I know he is not here." Lydia watched Nora's mouth as it set. His eyes are like the winter sky, cloudy, Nora said. She tilted the plate and caught her own face for a blink where the silver still took a reflection. The eyes met and then slid. She turned the picture over. On the back in pencil faint from time, a single word. Cedar. No names. Lydia put her palm on the table. Nora. Someone came back after the last snow. Someone cut wood. Someone set snares. That someone wears boots this size. She held her hands apart. We are not alone on dirt that nobody wants. Nora slipped the plate into her apron pocket. It made a cool press against her hip. We are here, she said. That is not the same thing. It is now. Nora took the glover she had patched for herself and saw that a seam had opened along the thumb. She threaded a needle with blue thread and set the leather across her knee and began to close the gap. The needle went through, and her finger took a prick and a bead of blood came and flattened. She sucked it away and kept sewing. The stitch line went small and tight, each knot a word she did not say. Lydia looked toward the door, and then at Maggie, and then at the flue where smoke made a neat ribbon. If he comes, she said. He will not, Nora said. She did not look up. Because you think he is gone, or because you think he is here and watching. That is two ways to say the same thing. Nora bit the thread and smoothed the seam with her thumb. She slid her hand into the glove and tested the fit. Better. She set the glove beside the rifle and stood. In the loft, Jonah took his mother's Bible from the saddlebag and held it closed. He did not open it. His thumb found the burned edge and wrote it. He listened to the house and heard the small sounds of people in it. A chair leg on board, a cough stifled and not stifled. He set the book back in the bag and turned his face into the darker corner of the loft where no one had ever put a window. The day thinned. Light came through the patched stovepipe and painted the wall with a pale stripe. The wind ran over the roof and tested the nails and found them the same as they had been at dawn. The yard held the prints of the morning. The pit sat open behind the aspen, its teeth bared to the empty sky. Inside, the candle burned low and fat at the base and smoked a little before it steadied. Nora laid a stick on the coals and watched for the pull, and felt it. Lydia folded the blanket up to Maggie's chin and smoothed it once where the breath lifted. The buck showed itself as a smudge between two aspen trunks. Antlers like dry brush, breath smoking. Nora steadied the Winchester against a sapling, and felt the tremor in her arms anyway. She drew a breath through the taste of cold iron, and lined the bead on a shoulder that held still longer than it should. A twig snapped under her boot, not loud. Loud enough. The buck broke and vanished into birch light and shadow in 3 long bounds. Another sound came from her left, not hoof, not leaf. A voice that was a stone rolling in a dry wash. You cost me meat. Nora spun and brought the rifle up. The sight swept across a man who was already close. He had stepped from the piñon like they had made him. Hair to his shoulders, face lean and set eyes, the winter sky over the pass. He did not look at the muzzle. He looked at her hands and how they shook. Stop, Nora said. The word came small through a mouth gone dry. He took one more step. Not a threat, a fact. The coat he wore was buckskin old enough to remember rain that no one else did. His left shoulder stayed a bit low. The rifle in his hand held like it belonged there. He did not point it. You cost me 3 days of tracks, he said. The wind has been wrong. You made it worse. We did not know anyone was hunting here. You do now? Nora tried to set her feet in a way that felt like the ground might help her stand. We will go, she said. We stopped to rest. My friend is sick. We are not staying. His eyes flicked once toward the gray house. He took in the smoke that rose thin from the pipe and the shutter tied with a strip of rag. When he looked back, his face had not changed. Something behind it had. You will go when the thaw lets the mountain take a hoof without breaking it, he said. Not before. Nora did not lower the rifle.